Caleb Thornton didn't knock. He never knocked. He shoved the gate open hard enough that the iron latch cracked against the post, and every head in that yard turned. Ranch hands, stable boys, even the old dog sleeping near the water trough lifted its head. Caleb walked straight toward the training pen with that particular kind of stride that men like him had perfected over generations. The walk of someone who had never once been told no and fully intended to keep it that way. He had a leather quirt in his right hand. Nobody said anything. Nobody moved. Inside the pen, the stallion, 16 hands of barely contained fear wrapped in muscle and dark bay hide, was standing at the far rail, ears pinned, watching this stranger the way a trapped animal watches something it already knows is going to hurt it. Caleb didn't slow down. He didn't even look at the horse's eyes. That was the moment Lydia Mercer, standing at the fence where she had stood every single morning for 3 weeks, understood that something terrible was about to happen, and that she was the only person on this ranch willing to stop it. If you've ever watched someone destroy a fragile thing just to prove they could, if you've ever been the only person in the room who saw the damage coming and couldn't make anyone listen, then you already understand exactly what kind of story this is. Stay with us until the very end. And if this is the kind of story that moves you, the kind with real people making hard choices and paying real prices for them, please subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss what's coming next. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it really began. The first thing anyone ever noticed about Silas Rowan was his hands. Not because they were large, though they were. Not because of the scars, though there were plenty of those too. White lines crossing the knuckles. A thick rope-burn scar running from the base of his left thumb down to his wrist that he'd gotten at 19 and never once explained to anyone who asked. People noticed his hands because of what they did when he was around horses, or more precisely, because of what they didn't do. Most men reached for a horse. Silas let horses reach for him. It was a small difference that most people missed entirely, and a few people found deeply unsettling, because it implied a kind of patience that doesn't come naturally to anyone and has to be learned through enough failure that the lessons leave marks. Silas had marks. He was 41 years old in the autumn of 1889, which in the world he moved through meant he was somewhere between veteran and ancient. His face had the particular quality of leather left out in weather. Not ugly, just deeply honest. Every year he'd lived showed somewhere. He had a slight hitch in his right knee from a fall in Wyoming that had never set quite right, and on cold mornings it reminded him of that fact loudly and without any sympathy whatsoever. He had never owned land. He had never stayed anywhere long enough to want to. He traveled with one horse of his own, a plain gray mare named Nothing Special, which was what people always said when they saw her, and which Silas had decided made it an appropriate name, a bedroll, a canvas bag with his tools, and a reputation that arrived in most towns about 2 days before he did. The reputation was this: Silas Rowan could break any horse. The more accurate version, which he had given up trying to explain to people because they generally didn't want to hear it, was Silas Rowan had learned to stop breaking horses and start listening to them instead, which turned out to work considerably better, but was a much harder thing to sell to men who equated gentleness with weakness and had the kind of pride that needed an animal's fear to feel like authority. He'd been hired to come to Blackridge Ranch by a letter that Gideon Mercer had written himself. The letter was short and practical in the way that men who've spent their whole lives measuring everything in profit and loss tend to write. There was a stallion. The stallion was valuable. The stallion had hurt people. The stallion needed to be broken. Could Silas come by 1st of October? Silas had read the letter twice, folded it into his shirt pocket, and finished his coffee before writing back a single line. I'll be there. Don't let anyone touch the horse before I arrive. He didn't know yet whether anyone had followed that instruction. In his experience, that kind of instruction was almost never followed. Blackridge Ranch sat at the end of a red dirt road that cut through open grazing land for the better part of 3 miles before the main house appeared. It was a working ranch, not a decorative one. The buildings were functional, the fences were repaired when they needed repairing, and not before. And the whole place had the particular smell of cattle and hay and honest labor that Silas had always found more comfortable than the smell of money trying to look like it wasn't. Gideon Mercer met him in the yard. He was a big man, Gideon, not tall exactly, but wide through the shoulders and dense in the way of men who had done hard physical work their whole lives, and then one day found themselves doing less of it and carrying the weight of that transition in their frame. He had a handshake that meant something, and gray in his beard that hadn't been there 5 years ago. His eyes moved to Silas and then immediately, instinctively, to nothing special, assessing the mare the way he would assess any working animal on his property. "She's playing," Gideon said. "She gets me there," Silas said. They understood each other well enough from that exchange to skip the part where they pretended to be friends before they'd established whether they respected each other. Gideon walked him to the training pen without preamble. Around them, ranch hands moved through their work with the particular quality of attention that people develop when someone new and important arrives, still doing their jobs, but doing them slightly more carefully and with their ears turned outward. The stallion was at the far end of the pen. Silas stopped at the fence and looked at him. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Gideon, to his credit, didn't rush him. The horse was extraordinary. That was the first thing, and it was obvious even from a distance. The kind of animal that made experienced horsemen go quiet because they understood immediately what they were looking at. Dark bay, almost black in certain light, with a depth of chest and length of stride that spoke to bloodlines assembled carefully over generations. He should have been magnificent. He should have been proud. Instead, he was standing with his head dropped slightly below the level of his withers, ears swiveling constantly, weight shifted to his hindquarters in a way that meant he was ready to move fast and wasn't sure yet which direction. There was a cut above his left eye that was recently healed, and the hair along his neck on the right side was rubbed wrong, which could mean a rope had been on him hard enough and long enough to disturb the grain of his coat. "How many men have ridden him?" Silas asked. "Tried to ride him," Gideon said. There was something careful in his voice. 4, 2 of them got off their own. 2 of them didn't get that choice. He hurt them bad. One's still walking with a cane, the other one's fine. Stubborn as the damn horse, so they deserved each other in my opinion. He paused. Broken rib and a collarbone between the 2 of them. Silas nodded slowly. His eyes never left the stallion. "Who had the rope on him?" "The right side there, where the coat's rubbed." Gideon was quiet for a beat too long. "Man I had before you." He was confident he had a method. Did his method have a name? He called it efficiency. Silas didn't comment on that. He didn't need to. "I'm not going to ride him today," he said. Gideon blinked. "You just got here." "I know when I got here. I'm paying you to break him." Silas finally looked away from the stallion and at Gideon directly. His voice stayed level, which somehow made what he said land harder than if he'd raised it. "If you want someone to force that horse into submission, you don't need me. There are men who'll do that. You won't like what comes out the other side, but they'll do it." He turned back to the pen. "If you want him to be what he could be, what he should be, then I need some time before I touch him. A few days, maybe more. I need to understand what he's afraid of before I can help him past it." The silence stretched out long enough that Silas genuinely wasn't sure which way it would break. "A few days," Gideon said finally. "Maybe more. You'll have them." Silas nodded once. He didn't say thank you. He didn't think Gideon was the kind of man who needed to be thanked for giving someone the conditions to do their job properly. What nobody told him, what he would piece together slowly over the following days, was that he wasn't the only one who'd been watching that stallion and seeing something different than everyone else. He found out about Lydia by accident, the way you find out about most things that turn out to matter. It was his second morning at Blackridge. He'd been up before the light, the way he always was, that left knee letting him know about the temperature drop before the sky did. He'd walked out to the pen with his coffee cooling in his hand, not intending to do anything in particular, just to be present, to let the horse get used to him being nearby without it meaning anything threatening. She was already there. She was standing at the far corner of the fence, far enough from the gate that she clearly hadn't intended to go in, close enough that the stallion could see her without having to work for it. She wasn't doing anything dramatic. She wasn't speaking or offering anything. She was just standing there with her arms folded on the top rail, watching the horse with an expression that Silas recognized because he'd felt it himself many times without ever being able to describe it. It was the expression of someone trying to figure out the language of another creature through pure attention. The horse was watching her back. That was the thing that stopped Silas mid-step, coffee cup halfway to his mouth. The horse was watching her back, and his ears were not pinned. His weight was square. His head was up at a neutral height, not dropped in exhaustion and not raised in alarm. He looked, for the first time since Silas had laid eyes on him, like an animal that wasn't actively bracing for something bad. Silas stood where he was and watched. She must have heard him eventually, because after a minute or two she glanced over her shoulder. She looked startled, not frightened, but caught off guard in the way of someone who'd gotten used to this being their private time and hadn't expected company. She was younger than he'd expected. He'd gotten some vague sense from Gideon that there was a daughter somewhere, but Gideon didn't talk about her the way fathers usually talked about daughters they were proud of. He mentioned her the way people mention furniture, as something that was simply there. She looked to be in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back practically, wearing working clothes rather than anything that announced her as the owner's daughter. Her eyes were steady and direct in a way that Silas had the immediate impression she had had to practice, because the world she lived in didn't particularly reward women who looked at things directly. "I didn't know anyone else was up," she said. "I'm usually the only one," Silas said. "Apparently not." She looked back at the horse. "He's calmer in the mornings, before the men start moving around." "What does he do when the men move around?" "Watches every single one of them the whole time, like he's keeping a count." She paused. "He doesn't do that with me." Silas took a sip of his coffee, which had gone cold. "How long have you been coming out here?" "Since he arrived." She said it like it was obvious. 3 months ago." 3 months. He'd been here 3 months. 17 different hands had tried to approach him in various ways according to what Gideon had told Silas. 2 men had gotten hurt, and this woman had been coming to this fence every morning for 3 months, and nobody had apparently thought to ask her what she'd noticed. "He's not mean," Lydia said. She said it with a particular emphasis, not arguing with someone present, but repeating something she'd argued before and lost. "He's scared. There's a difference, and most people here don't want to hear it." "Who'd you tell?" She looked at him. Just looked at him. The answer was obvious, and they both knew it. "What are you scared of?" she asked, and it took him a half second to realize she was still talking about the horse. "Have you figured that out yet?" "Not yet. I have some ideas." He doesn't like things coming at him from the left side. He doesn't like fast hands. He doesn't like rope. Any rope. Even just the sight of it coiled up. She said it matter-of-factly, like she was reading from notes she'd been keeping, which maybe she had been. "And he doesn't like being cornered, obviously, but I think that's less about the space and more about having no option to say no to something. He's better when he has room to refuse and chooses to come anyway." Silas was quiet for a moment. "You've been watching him every day for 3 months, he said. "Yes? And you figured all of that out?" "I had time," she said, in a way that indicated she had other things she could say about that, and had decided not to. He nodded slowly. "Could you show me where he tends to stand in the mornings, before anyone comes near him? The corner he chooses when he picks?" She looked at him again with that steady, practiced directness. She was checking whether he was making fun of her, or using her, or genuinely asking. Apparently she decided on the last one, because she turned back toward the fence and pointed. "There," she said. "The southeast corner. Always. The one where he can see the gate and both of the long rails at once." She paused. "Which I think means he wants to know all his exits before anyone asks him for anything." Silas looked where she was pointing. The horse was standing in exactly that corner right now, watching them both with those mobile ears tracking every sound. "That's a smart way of reading him," Silas said. Lydia Mercer said nothing, but something in her posture shifted slightly, the way a door shifts when someone on the other side finally leans against it. The ranch hands found the whole thing deeply amusing, and they were not particularly subtle about it. By the 3rd day, Silas had established a routine. He came to the fence in the morning, stayed near but not threatening, moved slowly when he moved at all, and did nothing that the horse didn't invite first. He brought a small canvas stool and sat on it sometimes. He drank his coffee. He talked occasionally, not to anyone in particular, just low sounds that weren't commands and didn't carry expectation in them. The ranch hands, rotating past on their various duties, made their commentary at a volume clearly designed to be heard. He's charging by the hour to drink coffee, is what he's doing. My grandmother makes friends with animals this way. She's 73. He could maybe learn a thing from her. Pretty soft approach for a man with his reputation. Silas heard all of it. He'd been hearing versions of all of it for 20 years. He had long since made peace with the fact that the kind of patience he practiced looked like weakness to people who'd never needed it. What was different here was Lydia. She came to the fence every morning, same as before. At first she stayed at her corner, and he stayed at his, the two of them occupying different edges of the same space with the horse between them in his southeast corner, watching them both. After a few mornings, without anything being said about it, she started coming to the rail closer to where Silas was. They didn't talk much. This suited both of them. What they did was share observations, which was a different thing from talking. Short, specific comments about what the horse was doing and what it might mean, offered and received without argument or ceremony. "He licked his lips when you stepped back just now," Lydia said one morning. "I noticed that." "That's a good sign. That's him releasing something." "Where'd you learn that?" She shrugged one shoulder. "Books, my father's library. He doesn't read most of them. He collects them more than he reads them. I started in on the horsemanship ones about 6 years ago." She paused. "I wasn't supposed to. He didn't exactly forbid it. He just made it clear that there were things that were my business and things that were not." Her voice was completely neutral saying this. "The horses were generally not." Silas turned this over. "You've been managing that for 6 years. "Managing what?" "Knowing things and not being allowed to act on them." She was quiet. Then, "I suppose that's one way to describe it." "What's your way?" She thought about it long enough that he was sure she was going to choose not to answer. Then she said quietly and without any drama in it at all, "Waiting. I suppose my way is waiting." The stallion, from his corner, exhaled long and slow, dropping his head by 3 inches. They both watched him do it. The trouble arrived on a Thursday, with Caleb Thornton's horse before Caleb himself, the way that certain kinds of trouble always announce themselves. Silas heard the hoofbeats coming down the long drive while he was still at the pen, and he looked up before the rider was visible, reading something in the pace of it. Not hurried exactly, but deliberate in the manner of someone who knew they were expected and was not going to arrive quietly. Caleb Thornton was perhaps 30, perhaps 32. He was the kind of physically imposing that money and never having been refused anything produces. Broad across the chest, easy in the saddle, with a smile that arrived on his face a moment too soon to be entirely natural and stayed a moment too long to be entirely comfortable. He wore good clothes that were meant to look practical. He shook Gideon's hand the way men who are auditioning to become family members shake the patriarch's hand, firmly and with eye contact and slightly longer than necessary. His eyes moved to Silas once, briefly, and dismissed him. His eyes moved to Lydia for slightly longer, with an expression that Silas did not like at all. Not because it was threatening, but because it was proprietary. The expression of a man regarding something he's already decided belongs to him and is simply waiting on the paperwork. "Father says you're making progress," Caleb said to the general heir, approaching the pen fence and looking in at the stallion with hands on his hips. "We're building trust," Silas said. "It takes time." Caleb nodded the way people nod when they're not actually agreeing but have decided the conversation isn't worth the energy of disagreement. "What's your timeline looking like?" "I don't work on a timeline." Something shifted in Caleb's expression, just slightly. "Every valuable thing has a timeline, Mr. Rowan. That's what makes it valuable." "The horse doesn't know what a timeline is," Silas said, "so I can't explain it to him, and it doesn't factor into my method." Caleb smiled. It didn't reach anything above his cheekbones. "I've always found that a firm approach with animals gets faster results. Horses need to know where they stand." "So do people," Lydia said. She said it quietly, almost to herself, looking not at Caleb, but at the stallion. The words were small, and the tone was mild, and somehow both men in proximity to her heard something in them that wasn't small at all. Caleb looked at her. "Of course, Lydia." She didn't look back. That evening, at supper, Silas ate in the bunkhouse with the hands the way he always did. He'd never been comfortable at the main house table, not because he was humble about it, but because supper tables in main houses involved a kind of performance he found exhausting. He learned things in bunkhouses. He listened to how men talked about their work and what it told him about what kind of work this was. What he heard about Caleb Thornton, assembled from fragments and half sentences over a plate of beans, was this. The Thornton family had the next ranch over, roughly 2,000 acres with good water access that Blackridge needed and that everyone knew it needed. The arrangement, Lydia to Caleb, the land dealt with between fathers, had apparently been under discussion long enough that some of the hands spoke of it as settled fact. Caleb was not cruel, by their account. He was simply the kind of man whose behavior had never been required to account for other people's feelings, and who therefore had never developed the habit. Silas ate his beans. He thought about Lydia at the fence saying, waiting in that flat, honest voice, like she was describing the weather. He thought about the stallion in his southeast corner, tracking every exit. He didn't think yet about what any of it meant for him. He was good, usually, at keeping his own situation separate from the work. The work was the horse. The rest of it was not his. He went to sleep telling himself that and almost believed it. Outside, the wind came down from the north and the temperature dropped another 8 degrees, and in the training pen the stallion stood in his corner in the dark and watched the gate and waited for whatever was coming next. The cold didn't break the next morning. If anything, it sharpened, the kind of dry October cold that made the air feel thinner and made every breath visible and reminded you, if you needed reminding, that the season was turning and things that had been possible in September were becoming less possible with each passing week. Silas was at the fence before first light, same as always. His knee had woken him up before the cold did, which was saying something. He'd lain on his bunk in the dark for 20 minutes, listening to the ranch settle around him. The particular creaks and sighs of a working spread, out in the small hours. Horses shifting in the main barn, one of the dogs moving somewhere near the bunkhouse door, and then he'd stopped pretending he was going to sleep again and gotten up. He made coffee on the bunkhouse stove, which was a simple iron thing that did its job without pretense, and he carried the cup out into the cold and walked to the pen. The stallion was already in his southeast corner. He looked at Silas the way he always looked at him now, not with the flat animal panic of the first days, but with something more complicated and more cautious. He was tracking. He was remembering. Silas could see the exact moment each morning when the horse ran through whatever internal accounting he kept and concluded, "This one hasn't hurt me yet." It wasn't trust. It wasn't even close to trust. But it was a starting point, and starting points were everything. Silas sat on his stool and drank his coffee and didn't ask the horse for anything. He heard her before he saw her. Her boots on the frozen ground had a particular sound, not heavy, but deliberate, each step placed with the care of someone who'd learned to move quietly through her own home and never entirely unlearned it. She came around the corner of the fence line and stopped when she saw him, the same small, startled pause as that first morning, and then she continued to the rail. She had a coat on today that was too large for her, clearly taken from somewhere else rather than bought for her. She held her own cup with both hands. They didn't say good morning. They'd stopped doing that after the third day, not out of rudeness, but because it had started to feel like a formality that didn't fit what they were actually doing out here. "He came forward about 2 feet yesterday evening," Lydia said. "After supper, when it was quiet." Silas looked at the stallion. "Toward the gate or toward the post?" "The center post. He stood there for about a minute and then went back." "That's something." "I thought so." The silence between them had gotten comfortable enough that it had its own texture. It wasn't empty. It was full of the sounds of the ranch waking up and the horse breathing and the wind coming down from the north, but it didn't need to be filled with words to feel inhabited. Then Lydia said, without any particular change in her tone, "Caleb is staying through the weekend." Silas kept his eyes on the horse. "I gathered. He wants to see the horse ridden before he leaves. That's not going to happen. I know." She took a sip of her coffee. "He won't like hearing it." "He'll hear it anyway." She made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh, more like the sound of someone recognizing a fact they'd already known. "My father is going to ask you to move faster. Caleb is going to suggest that you're not actually capable of doing what you said you could do." Has your father talked to you about the horse? He said it carefully, meaning something specific, and she understood what he meant. No, she said, flat and simple. My father doesn't ask me about the horse. He doesn't ask me about much. She paused. He's not unkind. I want to say that clearly. He's not a cruel man. He just has a very specific idea about what each person in his life is for, and he made up his mind about what I was for a long time ago, and it's been difficult to be anything else. Silas said nothing. He knew when words were being offered carefully and deserved to be received the same way. He has decided, Lydia continued, still looking at the horse, that I am for being Caleb Thornton's wife, which will give my father the water rights from the Eastern Creek, which he needs, and will give Caleb a bride who is considered in this county to be reasonably handsome and adequately raised, which is apparently what Caleb requires. She set her cup on the fence post. I have not been consulted about whether I agree. Have you told your father you don't agree? She turned and looked at him with an expression so patient it had a slight edge on it, the way very patient things sometimes do when they've been tested enough times. Mr. Rowan, in 1889 in this part of the country, a rancher's daughter disagreeing with her father's arrangement for her future is not a conversation, it is a declaration of war, and wars require weapons, and I have none. She picked her cup back up, or at least I had none before. She stopped. Before what? She looked at the stallion. Before someone showed up and started treating the thing everyone had given up on like it might still be worth something. The morning light was coming in thin and pale over the eastern fence line. The stallion shifted his weight, looked at them both, and very slowly extended his nose about 3 inches in their direction before drawing it back. Silas watched this with the particular quality of attention he normally reserved for important things. Then he looked at Lydia, who had seen it too. He's never done that, she said quietly. No, Silas said. He hasn't. The conversation with Gideon Mercer came sooner than Silas had expected, which meant it came before he felt ready for it, which was how those conversations usually went. He was in the tack room working through a piece of bridle hardware that had needed replacing for longer than it had actually gotten replaced. Not his bridle, but the kind of task that needed doing and that he'd volunteered for because it gave his hands something to do and his mind space to move around in. When Gideon appeared in the doorway with his arms crossed and the particular expression of a man who has been building up to a thing for several days. Caleb thinks we're wasting time, Gideon said. He said it without preamble, which Silas appreciated, even if he didn't appreciate the content. Caleb can think what he wants, Silas said. He's not wrong that we're 4 weeks from the first serious cold and an unridden horse is an unridden horse. He's not unridden because he can't be ridden. He's unridden because I haven't asked him yet. When are you going to ask him? Silas set the bridle piece down. He turned on his stool so he was facing Gideon directly, because this was a conversation that deserved to be had face to face. When he's ready. And I'm the only one who can judge that, which is why you wrote me that letter and not someone else. Gideon's jaw shifted. Not anger, more like a man chewing on a response he's already decided isn't worth making. Caleb has experience with horses. What kind of experience? He's broken. What kind of experience? Silas said again, with the particular patience that is also a kind of pressure. Has he spent time reading an animal's body language? Or has he spent time making animals do what he wants? Because those are different skills, and only one of them is useful to me right now. The silence in the tack room had a quality to it, the smell of leather and oil and old wood. Gideon said, He's going to be family. That's between you and your daughter, Silas said. The horse is between you and me. He's the same horse. Everything on this ranch is connected. Then let me do my work, and everything will be better for it. Gideon stood in the doorway a moment longer. He was doing the calculation that men like him always did, the weight of pride against the weight of practical necessity. He had hired Silas because he needed the best, and the best were difficult by nature, and he had always known that going in. It didn't make it easier. How long? He said. Not a question exactly. I'll have him accepting a rider within 2 weeks, Silas said, if nobody interferes. Gideon heard the last 3 words. His eyes moved to a middle distance somewhere over Silas's shoulder. I'll speak to Caleb. I'd appreciate it." He left. Silas picked up the bridle piece and went back to work, and his hands were steady, and he was fine. It was only later, walking back across the yard in the early evening light, that he noticed Lydia on the porch of the main house with a book open in her lap that she wasn't reading, watching Caleb Thornton talking to one of the older ranch hands near the barn with the easy authority of a man who'd already moved into a space and just hadn't updated the paperwork yet. Her face was arranged carefully in a way that gave nothing away, but her hands on the book were tight enough that her knuckles had gone pale. Silas kept walking. It was not his business. He told himself so specifically and deliberately, which was a sign that it was becoming his business whether he intended it to or not. The change in the stallion came on a Tuesday, 6 days after Caleb's arrival, at a moment so small and unremarkable that it almost didn't register. Silas had been in the pen, not riding, not doing anything that demanded anything, just moving slowly around the perimeter in the way he'd been doing for days, establishing that his presence didn't mean pressure. The stallion had been tracking him from the southeast corner with that careful mobile attention, ears moving, weight balanced. And then Silas stopped moving and simply stood still in the middle of the pen with his back to the horse and waited. This was the thing. This was the specific, unreasonable thing that the ranch hands found funniest and Gideon found most baffling. Silas turning his back on a horse that had put 2 men in serious recovery and standing there as if he'd completely forgotten what animal was behind him. He hadn't forgotten. He was listening to every sound. He knew the exact position of the stallion by the quality of silence behind him and where it was coming from. He heard the first footfall after about 3 minutes, one hoof placed carefully. Then nothing. The horse had taken 1 step and stopped, reconsidering. Silas didn't move. Another minute. 2 footfalls this time, closer together, and then a longer pause. He could hear the horse's breathing now, which meant the horse was close enough that he could hear it. His heart was doing something that he would not have described as fear, but was certainly something in that neighborhood. Then he felt it. The breath first, warm and damp against the back of his left shoulder. And then, so lightly it was almost imagined, the brush of a muzzle against the canvas of his jacket. He stayed absolutely still. The horse sniffed him thoroughly. The back of his neck, his hair, the right shoulder, the left. It was the investigation of an animal that has decided, provisionally and with reservations, that the threat might not actually be a threat. It went on for almost a minute. Then the horse stepped back and walked back to his corner. Silas exhaled. Lydia was at the fence. He hadn't heard her arrive. She moved quietly enough when she wanted to. She was standing with both hands on the top rail, and her expression had something in it that he didn't quite have words for. It wasn't surprise exactly. It was more like watching something you'd hoped might happen, actually happen. He walked slowly to the fence. He was careful about how he moved, even now, especially now. "That was the first time," she said. "Yes. I've been waiting 3 months for that to happen." "I know." He stood next to her at the rail and they both looked at the horse in his corner. "You were part of why it did. He's been watching you come to this fence every morning. You've been teaching him that people can be around without something bad following." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't think of it that way. That's usually how the best things work." She turned and looked at him. That direct look, the one that had clearly been a practice and had become a habit. "Do you always do that?" "Do what?" "Tell people when they've contributed something, even when they didn't know they were doing it." He thought about it honestly. "No, not always. Sometimes I forget." He looked at the horse. "I'm trying to be better at it." The evening was coming down around them, and the temperature was falling fast, and in the barn behind them, one of the mares was calling and being answered by her foal. And it was, objectively, a very ordinary Tuesday on a working ranch in a cold autumn. Lydia picked up her coat from the fence post where she'd set it and said, half to herself, "He's going to try to take credit for this somehow. Caleb is. When the horse is ready, he's going to find a way to stand near it and have it reflected on him." "That's his problem," Silas said. "It becomes everyone else's problem, too. That's the thing about men like that. Their problems don't stay contained." She put her coat on. "Good night, Mr. Rowan." Good night, Miss Mercer. She walked back toward the house, and he stayed at the fence until it was fully dark. The next morning, Caleb Thornton was at the pen before either of them. This was new, and Silas registered it the way you register any unexpected change in a pattern, not with alarm, but with the heightened attention of someone who knows that unexpected changes have reasons, and the reasons are worth understanding. Caleb was standing at the gate, not the fence rail, the gate itself, with his arms crossed and the look of a man who has come to a conclusion and intends to share it. He was dressed for riding. That detail settled into Silas's chest like a stone dropping into water. "Morning," Caleb said. His voice was easy and cordial and completely immovable. "I thought I'd have a look at what you've been doing, up close." "You can look from the fence," Silas said. "I've looked from the fence for 6 days." He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had decided to be pleasant because pleasant was more effective than direct in front of witnesses. 2 of the ranch hands had drifted into proximity, doing nothing in particular. "I thought I might get a sense of whether all this time has actually produced any results." "You're not going in the pen." "Gideon hasn't told me I can't." "I'm telling you, you can't." The smile didn't move. Something behind it did. "With respect, Mr. Rowan, you're an employee, same as everyone else here. You don't set the rules for who can and can't approach the ranch's horses." Silas kept his voice even. He'd had enough versions of this conversation with enough versions of this man to have learned that raising his voice only made the other man feel like he'd won something. "The animal in that pen has already put 2 men in recovery. My job is to build his trust enough that he stops doing that. Every time someone comes at him wrong, we lose ground. So yes, I'm telling you that you're not going in the pen, and if you have a problem with that, you can go talk to Gideon, and I will be here doing my job when you get back." Caleb looked at him with an expression that was no longer particularly pleasant. It was the expression of a man recalibrating, not retreating, just adjusting for the terrain. "You've been out here a month," Caleb said. "How much longer?" "However long it takes." That's not an answer. "It's the only honest one I've got." Caleb looked past him at the horse in the pen, and his eyes did the thing that eyes do when they're measuring a gap between what something is and what it should be. He looked at the stallion the way men like him looked at most things, as a problem that needed solving in the most direct available manner, and as a reflection of the competence of the people who hadn't already solved it. "A horse needs to know who's in charge," Caleb said. It was the kind of thing someone says when they've said it many times before and found that it generally closes arguments. That's not cruelty, that's clarity. "Some things," Silas said carefully, "that look like clarity are actually just fear dressed up in different clothes." Caleb held his gaze for a 3 count. Then he uncrossed his arms, turned, and walked back toward the main house with that same deliberate stride. The 2 ranch hands found somewhere else to be. Silas turned back to the pen. The stallion was in his corner watching the gate where Caleb had been standing. Every muscle in his body held at a tension that said, "I knew it. I knew something like that was going to happen." "Easy," Silas said softly, to the horse, to nobody in particular. "Easy. He's gone." The stallion's ears moved. His breathing didn't slow for another 10 minutes. Lydia found out about the confrontation from one of the kitchen women, which meant it had traveled through 4 people before it reached her, and by the time it did, it had taken on the slight additional drama that stories always accumulate in transit. She came to the fence that afternoon looking composed, but with a tightness around her eyes that told a different story. "He's going to go to my father tonight," she said. "I know. My father is going to listen to him. Probably. And tomorrow morning this situation may be considerably different than it is right now." She looked at the stallion, who was calmer in the afternoon than the morning had earned. He had a resilience to him that Silas had started to notice, a capacity to return to some baseline between disturbances that spoke to the animal he could become if given enough time. "I want you to know that whatever happens tomorrow, what you've done with him, what's happened this past week, it's real. Whatever he decides." Silas leaned on the fence rail. "I've been in this situation before, ranchers who hired me and then got impatient, horse getting caught in the middle." "What happened?" He was quiet for a moment. "Different things, depending on the rancher." He looked at the horse. The ones who trusted the process came out better. The ones who didn't, he didn't finish it. The horse usually came out worse regardless. Lydia folded her arms on the top rail, mirroring his posture without apparently intending to. I don't want that for him. Neither do I. Then we need to be further along before tonight. He looked at her. She was looking at the stallion, and her profile in the afternoon light was serious and definite in a way that reminded him, suddenly and without warning, of his mother, who had been a woman with no authority over anything important and had therefore directed all her considerable intelligence into being the most accurate reader of situations in any room she'd ever occupied. The accuracy had never saved her from much, but it had let her see things coming, which was something. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking," Lydia said carefully, "that if you could enter the pen today with the horse accepting you, and I could be there too, if you could get him to come to you voluntarily with someone else present, it would be harder to argue that nothing's been accomplished. That's true. Would it be safe for you to come in?" He thought about it honestly, running the real calculus rather than the reassuring version. "It should be. He's been watching you at the fence long enough that you're familiar. You're not a threat to him. But I'd need you to follow specific instructions about how you move and where you stand. And if I tell you to go to the gate, you go immediately. No questions." "Understood." "I mean it. No hesitation." She looked at him. "Mr. Rowan, I have been standing at this fence watching this horse for 3 months because nobody would let me do anything else. If you tell me to leave, I will leave. I've had enough practice at that." The gate opened quietly. Silas went first, moving the way he always moved inside that pen, like someone who had all the time in the world and nowhere else to be. Lydia followed 3 steps behind him, and she read the space the way he'd hoped she would, without performance, without nervous energy, just a person being still in a place. The stallion moved immediately to the back of his corner. Silas stopped, didn't look at the horse, waited. Lydia stopped beside him and did the same. She had the natural quality that some people carry and most people have to work for, the ability to be somewhere without demanding that the somewhere acknowledge them. The waiting lasted 8 minutes. Silas counted. Then the stallion's ears came forward, his head lifted slightly. He made the same tentative forward step he'd made with Silas in the pen, 1 foot, a pause, consideration, and then 2 more, and then 3, until he was close enough that his breath could be heard clearly, and his eyes were moving between them both with a quality that was not fear and was not yet trust, but was something that lived in the small territory between them. He stopped about 4 feet away. He looked at Lydia. She didn't move, didn't speak, didn't reach for him. And then the stallion stretched his neck out, very slowly, with the exquisite caution of an animal that has learned caution the hard way, and touched his nose to her forearm. Lydia made a sound that she immediately controlled, but not before it had escaped. It was a small sound, almost nothing, the sound of something that had been held closed for a long time opening by a crack. The stallion drew back but didn't retreat to his corner. He stood where he was and looked at them both, and his weight was square, and his ears were forward, and for 30 seconds he looked exactly like what he had always been underneath the fear, an extraordinary animal that had never been given the conditions to demonstrate it. "There," Silas said softly, to himself as much as anything. Lydia's arm, where the horse had touched it, was held slightly away from her side. She was breathing with the careful deliberateness of someone managing an emotion too large for the moment. "Does this change anything?" she asked. Almost a whisper. "It changes everything," Silas said, "whether your father sees it or not." They stood there in the fading afternoon light while the stallion watched them with those dark, careful eyes, and somewhere across the ranch yard a door opened and closed, and the ordinary machinery of the day continued around them, indifferent to the fact that something had just shifted. The question was whether it had shifted enough. Gideon Mercer sat down to supper that evening with Caleb on his right side and an empty chair where Lydia usually sat, because Lydia had told the kitchen woman she wasn't hungry and gone to her room instead. Caleb talked for most of the meal about the condition of the eastern fence line and the water rights situation, and what his father thought about a particular county bill coming up in the legislature. He was charming and informed and spoke with the easy authority of a man who had been prepared since birth to sit at tables like this one and be listened to. And at some point during the meal, in the way that powerful men have of introducing the subject they actually came to discuss after establishing the comfortable territory first, Caleb said, "I think we may need to have a frank conversation about Mr. Rowan's methods and his timeline." Gideon looked at his plate. He thought about what he'd seen that afternoon in the pen. A quick glimpse through the barn passage, not enough to understand what was happening, just enough to see his daughter and the horsebreaker standing inside the pen with the animal that had hurt two of his men, standing there quietly, and the horse not 3 feet away from them. He didn't know what to do with what he'd seen yet. "I'll talk to him," Gideon said. "Tonight," Caleb said, and it wasn't quite a question. "Tomorrow," Gideon said. And something in the way he said it was, very slightly, different from how he might have said it yesterday. Caleb noticed. He was the kind of man who noticed small changes in the temperature of rooms. He picked up his fork and said nothing more about it that evening, which was its own kind of statement. Upstairs, Lydia sat on the edge of her bed with the lamp lit and a letter half written on her knee. To a cousin in Denver, the kind of letter she wrote and usually didn't send, and looked at her forearm where the stallion had touched her, which looked like nothing at all from the outside and felt from the inside like an apology from something that had never meant to become what it was. Gideon came to the pen the next morning, not at the hour Silas expected, not at the reasonable working hour of a man making a planned visit, but early, before most of the hands were moving, early enough that the frost on the fence rails hadn't yet decided whether to melt or stay. He came alone, without Caleb, and he stood at the rail for a long time before he said anything at all. Silas was already inside the pen, not doing much. He'd brought a length of soft rope that morning, not to use, but simply to have present, to let the stallion see it and understand that its presence didn't automatically mean pain. The horse was watching the rope from his corner with an attention so total it was almost meditative. He hadn't bolted. That was the whole point. 6 weeks ago, a coiled rope thrown casually over a fence post would have sent him into the far rail. This morning, he was watching it the way a cautious man watches something he's decided might not be a weapon. Progress was almost always invisible until it wasn't. Gideon cleared his throat. Silas walked to the fence. "You put my daughter in that pen yesterday," Gideon said. His voice was even, but there was something working underneath it. "She came in of her own choice," Silas said. "I set the conditions and she agreed to them. She's not a ranch hand. No, but she knows that horse better than any ranch hand you've got. Better than most people I've worked with professionally, and I've worked with a good number." Gideon looked at the stallion. The horse had turned slightly so he could see both of them at the rail, ears tracking, not alarmed. "Caleb thinks the situation needs a firmer resolution." "I know what Caleb thinks. He's been around horses his whole life." "So has almost everyone in this county," Silas said, with no particular heat in it. "That doesn't mean that they've been paying attention." The silence had that specific morning quality, the kind of quiet that has weight to it, that is made up of things not being said. A rooster started somewhere near the main barn and stopped almost immediately, as if it had thought better of it. "What did you see yesterday?" Gideon asked. It came out differently than his other questions, less rehearsed. He was genuinely asking. Silas considered how to answer that honestly. "Your daughter stood in the pen with an animal that has been terrified of people for longer than you've owned him. She didn't perform. She didn't demand. She just was there. And he came to her." He looked at Gideon. "He chose it. That's the thing that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't seen it. There's a specific quality to movement that an animal chooses versus movement that's been forced out of it, and they are completely different things. What I saw yesterday was choice." Gideon's jaw did that working thing again. And Lydia was part of that. She was the reason for most of it. The silence this time was of a different quality. It had something shifting in it. "She never told me she'd been studying the horse," Gideon said. There was something in his voice that might have been the early edge of something he wasn't ready to name yet. Not guilt, exactly. More like a man standing at the boundary of a territory he'd never mapped because he'd assumed there was nothing worth mapping there. "Would you have listened?" Silas said. He said it without accusation, just as a question that deserved to be asked. Gideon didn't answer that, which was its own kind of answer. I need 2 more weeks, Silas said. 2 weeks without interference, and that horse will accept a rider. The right rider handled the right way. After that, he'll be what you paid for him to be, and more than that. He paused. But I need those 2 weeks to be actually 2 weeks, not 2 weeks with conditions attached. Gideon looked at him with the careful, weighing expression of a man who has spent his life making decisions that cost things. Caleb has plans to leave Sunday. I understand that. He'd like to see something before he goes. Then he can stand at the fence and watch me work. Silas kept his voice level. What he won't do is come inside that pen or put his hands on that animal or make any decision about the training process, because if he does, we lose everything we've built, and I pack my bag that same afternoon. That's not a negotiation. It was the closest Silas had come to raising his voice. He hadn't raised it, but the weight behind the words was different, and Gideon heard it. 2 weeks, Gideon said finally. 2 weeks. Gideon nodded once, turned, and walked back toward the house. He walked like a man carrying something he hadn't been carrying on the way over. Silas wasn't sure yet whether that was good or bad, but he noticed it. He turned back to the pen. The stallion had moved 4 feet out of his corner during the conversation, imperceptible unless you knew where to look for it, and was standing with his head at a neutral height, watching Silas with those dark, mobile eyes. Yeah, Silas said to him quietly. Me too. Lydia came to the fence that morning later than usual. When she arrived, she had the look of someone who had been in a conversation they'd been steeling themselves for, composed on the surface with the careful composure of someone who has had a great deal of practice at it, but with something behind her eyes that had been scraped at. He spoke to you this morning, she said. Not a question. About the pen. He spoke to me too. She set her hands on the rail. He wanted to know how long I'd been studying the horse. What did you tell him? The truth. 3 months of watching and 6 years of reading. She paused. He didn't know about the reading, the books. Something moved across her face. He stood there in the kitchen while I told him, and I couldn't read him at all, which is unusual. My father is not a complicated man in most ways. He's usually legible. She looked at the stallion. He asked why I hadn't told him. What did you say? I told him that I had tried once, when the horse first arrived. I'd come to him and said I thought the horse was frightened and that forcing him would make it worse. She was quiet for a moment. He told me to let the men handle it. The morning was still, and the cold had settled into a kind of permanence that felt like it wasn't leaving. Somewhere behind the barn, a gate banged once in the wind. What did he say this morning when you told him that? Silas asked. Lydia was quiet long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, nothing at first, and then he said, she stopped, started again. He said he didn't realize. She said it carefully, like she was still deciding what those words meant and whether they were enough. Which I suppose is true. He didn't realize because realizing would have required paying attention to something he'd already decided didn't need his attention. Her voice stayed flat and informational. I'm not angry at him. I want to be clear about that. I've been angry and it passed, and what's left is just tired. I'm tired of being someone who knows things that nobody asks about. He's asking now, Silas said, because you made him. She turned and looked at him directly. Because you showed him that what I'd been seeing was real. He needed a man to confirm it before it became real to him. And she stopped, pressed her lips together. I know that's how things work. I've always known. That doesn't make it simple to sit with. He didn't argue with any of it because it was all accurate, and she knew it was accurate, and false comfort was a particular thing he had never been able to offer people, no matter how much they might have preferred it in the moment. The horse came to you, he said instead. Whatever your father needed to see, it confirmed. The horse came to you. That's not about me. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the stallion who had drifted in the slow, unhurried way of an animal with nowhere specific to be, about 6 feet out of his corner. It was the farthest he'd voluntarily stood from the wall since Silas had arrived. I notice he's getting braver, she said. He's getting safer, Silas said. It's not the same thing. Brave implies there was a choice about the fear. He was never choosing to be afraid. He just was afraid. Now he's becoming less afraid. and it looks like courage from the outside, but from the inside it's just relief. Lydia looked at him with a particular quality of attention. That's a very specific way of understanding it. I've had some experience with it. She seemed to consider whether to ask about that, and then decided something. What were you afraid of? It was a direct question, and she'd asked it directly, which he appreciated enough that he gave it a direct answer rather than deflecting it. Staying, he said, in one place, with one thing. Being the person who was there when it went wrong. He watched the horse. It's easier to move. You don't accumulate damage that way. And yet, you're still here. I'm still here, he agreed. He didn't say anything else about it, and she didn't push. Caleb Thornton spent Friday in a particular mood that the ranch hands described among themselves with the word coiled. Not explosive, not aggressive, just wound tight in the way of a man who had received information that conflicted with his understanding of his own position and was processing that conflict with great internal effort and no external acknowledgement. He was perfectly civil at meals. He was perfectly civil in the yard. He was the kind of civil that is itself a statement, that says, with each reasonable word and easy smile, I am being very patient about something. He watched Silas from a distance. He didn't approach the pen again. He watched Lydia with eyes that had taken on an additional quality, something that was still proprietary, but was now also calculating in a way it hadn't been before, as if he'd noticed a variable he hadn't previously factored and was adjusting his equations accordingly. Lydia felt it. Silas noticed her noticing it, which meant he was watching her more than he'd intended to, which was a thing he'd have to deal with in the privacy of his own thinking at some point. Saturday morning came in with iron clouds from the northwest that everyone on the ranch correctly read as snow within the next 48 hours. The temperature had dropped another 15 degrees overnight. The horses in the main barn were restless with the pressure change, the way horses get before hard weather. Not afraid, just tuned to something humans couldn't hear. Silas had been planning to introduce the saddle blanket that morning. Not the saddle, just the blanket, folded to let the stallion smell it and decide about it. He'd had saddle blankets rejected spectacularly by horses who turned out fine later, and he'd had horses accept them on first presentation, and he'd never successfully predicted which was going to happen. You brought the thing, and you paid attention, and you adjusted. He was pulling on his jacket in the bunkhouse when one of the younger ranch hands, a boy named Ellis, who was 17 and still had the quality of alertness to everything that the years would eventually dull, appeared in the doorway with a look that Silas registered and was on his feet from before Ellis had finished his first sentence. "Mr. Thornton's in the pen," Ellis said. The air between the bunkhouse and the training pen covered about 90 yards. Silas covered it in a way that was not quite running but was everything short of it, and he was aware, distantly, that his bad knee was going to have opinions about this later. He heard the horse before he saw what was happening. Not screaming, the stallion wasn't a screamer, but a sound that was wrong in a specific way, a grunt of effort and fear that had a panicked edge to it, and the percussion of hooves on hard ground, striking with the irregular, desperate rhythm of an animal trying to find footing it couldn't find. He came around the corner of the fence line and stopped. Caleb was inside the pen. He had a rope. Not Silas's rope, something from the barn tack rail, thicker and stiffer. And he'd gotten it over the stallion's neck, and the horse was doing exactly what Lydia had told Silas he would do 6 weeks ago, going sideways and up and sideways again with a kind of blind mechanical panic, not fighting the rope the way a horse with experience fights, but throwing himself against it the way a frightened thing throws itself against the thing that's caught it. The fence was shaking. Caleb was holding the rope with both hands and had planted his feet and had the expression of a man who had committed to a course of action and was going to see it through on pure stubbornness alone, which was exactly the most dangerous possible combination. "Let go of the rope," Silas said. His voice came out very quiet. "Let go of it now." "He'll run. Let go of the rope." Caleb's hands opened and the rope dropped, and the stallion hit the far rail and bounced off it with a sound like a hammer strike and came back towards center, still moving wrong, and Silas went through the gate. He walked into the pen the same way he always walked into the pen. The same gait, the same rhythm, the same pace, despite everything in his body screaming at him to run. Running would be wrong. Running would add a new variable to a situation that already had too many variables. Easy, he said, to the horse, to the air, to whatever would listen. Easy. You're all right. Easy now. The stallion's eyes were white-edged, and he was breathing in the short, fast way that meant he was fully inside the panic. He shied away from Silas's approach. First time in 2 weeks he'd done that, and hit the rail again with his hindquarters, and made that sound again. From somewhere behind him, Silas heard the gate open, and his first instinct was to shout at whoever it was to get out. But then he heard the specific quality of the footfall, and he didn't say anything. Lydia walked into the pen. She walked to a position about 8 feet to Silas's left, far enough that she and Silas formed 2 points of a triangle with the horse at the third, close enough that the stallion could see them both without having to swing his head more than a few degrees. She didn't look at Silas for instructions. She stood the way she'd learned to stand, empty-handed, quiet in her body, not demanding anything. The stallion looked at her. He was still breathing too fast. His hooves were still striking in that nervous percussion. But his eyes found her, and something in them changed in the way eyes change when they locate something familiar in a space that has become unfamiliar. "There he is," Lydia said, very quietly. "There you are." She wasn't talking to anyone in the human sense. The words were barely words, more like the sound version of presence, of being there. The stallion's breathing slowed by 1 degree, 1 fraction of a degree. Silas moved. Very slowly, in a wide arc that took him away from any line between the horse and the gate, giving the horse the exit, making the exit feel open and available, and therefore less necessary to take. He talked as he moved, low and continuous, and saying nothing in particular, the content irrelevant, the sound the point. It took 11 minutes. Silas counted them. Not in real time. His sense of time had gone strange inside the pen, the way it always did when something was at stake. But he counted breaths and movements, and the slow degrees of change, and later he figured it at 11 minutes. The stallion's head came down. His eyes unwidened. He blew out a long, unsteady breath and stood still, trembling slightly through the haunches, but still. His eyes moved to Lydia and stayed there with an exhausted, shaken trust that was almost painful to look at directly. Lydia moved to him then, finally, after all that stillness, and put her hand on his neck. Just her hand, flat against the muscle. He flinched once and then stood. She looked at Silas over the horse's back. Her face was doing something complicated. He gave a very small nod. She gave one back. Then he turned around. Caleb was at the gate. He had his arms at his sides and his rope was on the ground, and the easy cordiality was entirely gone from his face, replaced by something raw that was probably the real thing underneath it. Not malice, exactly, but the particular kind of shame that comes from having been witnessed being wrong in a way that you can't argue your way out of. Silas walked to the gate and stopped on his side of it. He didn't trust himself to say many words, so he chose them carefully. "You could have broken his leg," he said, "or your neck, or both." Caleb said nothing. "That rope going slack when he went sideways, Kiki. If he'd hit the rail at the wrong angle with that tension, he stopped. It doesn't matter. What matters is what happens now." "I was trying to demonstrate," Caleb started. "I know what you were trying to demonstrate." The quiet in Silas's voice had gotten a different quality. Not anger. Something more tired than anger. "You wanted to show that a different approach would work faster, and I don't know how to tell you this in a way that will reach you, but if you'd walked in here yesterday, when he was where he was, and done what you just did, you'd have undone 5 weeks of work. Everything. All of it. Gone. Because that's how trust works with a frightened animal. It goes up a stair at a time and comes down through the floor." He looked at Caleb. "And with people, too. In my experience." Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Not softened. Shifted. The way ground shifts before a weather change, not obviously, but perceptibly. "It's not broken," Caleb said, grudgingly. "Whatever you were building, it's not broken." "Not completely," Silas said. "Because she was here." He didn't say Lydia's name. He didn't need to. They both knew who he meant and why. Caleb looked past him at Lydia, still with her hand on the stallion's neck, talking to him, in a low, continuous voice. He looked at her for a long time with an expression that Silas could not fully interpret, which was unusual. Caleb was generally a legible man once you knew what to look for, but this expression had something in it that was new. Then Caleb picked up the rope from the ground, which was the right thing to do, and walked back toward the barn, which was also the right thing to do. Silas let out a breath and went back to the horse. The story of what happened in the pen that morning traveled the ranch by lunch and reached Gideon Mercer in a version that was stripped of nuance but accurate in its essential facts. Caleb had gone into the pen with a rope, the horse had panicked, Lydia had gone in and helped bring him down. Gideon listened to it from his ranch foreman, a laconic man named Pruitt, who had worked for him for 11 years and had the quality of reporting things without editorializing that Gideon had always valued. He sat with it through the noon meal, which he ate alone because Caleb had gone out on a long ride, processing, presumably, and Lydia was still at the barn. He sat with it the way a man sits with a thing that is rearranging itself inside him, not comfortable and not fast. After lunch, he walked out to the training pen and stood at the rail. Silas was inside doing nothing in particular, just being there. The stallion was standing about 10 feet away from him, not in his southeast corner, just standing in the general space of the pen as if he had several options about where to be and hadn't decided yet. Gideon watched them for a while. "She went in after him," Gideon said when Silas approached the rail. "Lydia. She went in when the horse was— She knew what she was doing," Silas said. "I won't pretend it wasn't a risk. It was. She went in anyway." "That's—" Gideon stopped. He was looking at the stallion. "My wife," he said after a moment. "Before she passed, she had a way with the animals. I used to—" He stopped again, started over. "I always thought Lydia got that from her. I never thought to—" He closed his mouth on whatever he'd been about to say. Silas waited. "She should have been part of this from the beginning," Gideon said. He said it quietly, in the voice of a man making a confession to himself rather than a statement to an audience. "Yes," Silas said, simply. Gideon looked at him with an expression that was a complicated thing. A father's particular kind of pride that has shame mixed into it, which is one of the hardest emotional combinations a person can carry. "She's been coming here every morning since the horse arrived." "Every morning," Silas confirmed, "and nobody told me. Nobody asked her." He kept his voice even. "That's how it's been going." The stallion walked, with no prompting, no invitation, no pressure of any kind, to a position about 12 feet from the rail where Gideon stood. He stood there and looked at the older man with an attention that was curious rather than afraid. Gideon looked back at the horse. "He looks different than he did a month ago." "He is different than he did a month ago." "He looks like—" Gideon searched for the word. "Like he's thinking." "He was always thinking," Silas said. "He just couldn't think about anything except what was going to hurt him next." He looked at the stallion. "When the fear takes up that much space, there's nothing left over for anything else." Gideon was quiet for a long time. The clouds from the northwest had moved in closer, and the light had the flat white quality of snow coming, and somewhere in the main barn a horse stamped once. "Caleb is a good man," Gideon said, finally. Not arguing, more like sorting through something out loud. "He's not— What happened this morning wasn't—" He exhaled. "He made a mistake." "He did," Silas said. "He wasn't going to add to it. It didn't need adding to." "I've been—" Gideon stopped, set his hands on the rail, looked at them. "I've been making arrangements for Lydia's future based on what I thought I understood about what she needed, about what she was." He said "was" and seemed to hear himself say it and didn't correct it, because correcting it would have required going somewhere he wasn't ready to go yet. Silas said nothing. This was not his conversation to participate in. "She told me this morning that she had gone to me 6 weeks ago about the horse." The words came out effortful. "When he first arrived, that she'd tried to tell me." "I know." "You knew that?" "She told me, yes." Gideon looked at him. The look had something in it that was not resentment, but was in the same vicinity. The look of a man who has realized that the people around him have been having conversations he wasn't part of, and that he has only himself to blame for the exclusion. "She must have told you a great deal." She told me about the horse, Silas said carefully. Mostly she showed me. She's been the best source of information I've had on this job. More useful than anything you told me, with respect. Gideon absorbed this with the expression of a man absorbing something that is accurate and unwelcome and true in equal parts. I owe her an apology, he said at last. That's between you and her, Silas said. I can't speak to what she needs to hear from you. No, of course. Gideon straightened up from the rail. He looked older than he had a month ago in the way that realizations age people faster than years do. The horse will be ready in 2 weeks? 2 weeks, with no more interference. There won't be any. He paused. Caleb is leaving Sunday as planned. Silas nodded once. Gideon walked back toward the house. His stride was the same as always, but something in the set of his shoulders was different. A man who had put something down that he'd been carrying so long he'd stopped noticing the weight of it. Inside the pen, the stallion walked with slow, deliberate steps back toward Silas. He stopped about 3 feet away. He lowered his head to a comfortable level and stood there, and his breathing was even, and his eyes were soft, and you could see, if you were someone who knew how to look, if you'd spent enough time learning the language of frightened animals finding their way back to themselves, you could see exactly who he was underneath everything that had been done to him. Silas put one hand on the side of his neck, very gently, and the horse didn't move. Almost, Silas said quietly. We're almost there. He didn't know yet whether he was talking to the horse. The snow started just after supper. It came in light at first, the way the first snow of the season usually did in that country. Tentative, as if testing whether it was welcome, and then steadier, covering the yard and the fence rails and the roof of the training pen in white that muffled sound and made the whole ranch feel smaller and closer and more itself. Lydia stood at the window of her room and watched it come down and held a cup of tea with both hands and thought about a horse choosing to stand near a person, and a person choosing to stand near a horse, and all the things those two choices said about what trust actually was when you got down to the bottom of it. She thought about her mother, who had also stood at this window in other winters and other snows, and about the books in her father's library that she'd read in secret, and about the specific exhaustion of knowing things in silence for years at a time. She thought about Silas Rowan saying you were part of why it happened in the flat, honest way of someone who didn't offer that kind of thing lightly. She didn't think about Caleb Thornton at all. That was in itself a thing worth noticing. The snow stayed 2 days and left the ground hard and the air sharp, and the whole ranch with the particular quality of a place that has been reminded of its own smallness against the season and has accepted the reminder without complaint. Caleb Thornton left on Sunday as planned. He rode out in the early morning before most of the ranch was moving, which Silas registered as a choice, the choice of a man who preferred exits without audiences. He did stop at the main house long enough to speak with Gideon, and from the bunkhouse window Silas watched the two of them on the porch for about 10 minutes, their breath visible in the cold air, their postures telling a story that was quieter than whatever words they were exchanging. Gideon with his arms at his sides, attentive in the way of someone receiving something. Caleb with his hat in his hands, which was the most genuinely unguarded Silas had seen him in 3 weeks. He didn't watch for Lydia. He didn't see her come out. Later he would learn from Ellis, who was 17 and observed everything because he hadn't yet learned not to, that Caleb had knocked on Lydia's door that morning before he came to the porch, that he'd stood in the hallway outside her room for a minute or two and then knocked again, that she had opened the door and they had spoken for about 5 minutes in voices too low to carry, that she had not come downstairs to see him off. Silas filed all of this away in the part of his mind where he kept things he didn't have the right to have opinions about yet. The week after Caleb left had a different texture than the weeks before it. Partly the weather, the cold had settled into a serious permanence that meant everyone on the ranch was working a degree harder than usual, the simple maintenance tasks of winter preparation layering on top of the regular work. But partly it was something else, some shift in the atmosphere of the place that Silas felt but couldn't precisely name, as if the ranch itself had exhaled something it had been holding. The stallion felt it too. Animals were better than people at reading the emotional temperature of a place because they had to be. Their safety depended on it in ways that human safety only sometimes did. In the days after Caleb's departure, the horse moved differently in the pen. Still careful, still watchful, but with a quality that Silas found himself thinking of as larger, as if the animal was exploring the boundaries of himself, testing what was possible now that a particular pressure had been removed. Silas introduced the saddle blanket on Monday. The stallion smelled it for 4 minutes, then walked away, then came back and smelled it again. By Wednesday, he was standing still while Silas held it against his side. By Friday, the blanket was being folded and placed briefly on his back and removed, placed and removed, the repetition establishing the thing as ordinary and therefore unfrightening. Lydia watched all of this from the fence. Their morning routine had become so established that Silas had stopped thinking of it as something that happened and had started thinking of it as something that simply was. A fixed point of the day, the way certain stars become fixed points of navigation once you've used them long enough. She brought her coffee. They talked and didn't talk in the rhythms they'd worked out. She told him things about the horse he needed to know and some things about herself that he hadn't expected and that settled into him in ways he noticed only gradually. The way temperature changes are easier to register by their accumulation than their individual degrees. He's starting to understand that things can be put on him and taken off again, she said one morning, watching the blanket work. That it doesn't have to mean anything terrible. That's the whole project, Silas said. Just that. Things don't have to mean what they've meant before. She looked at him in the way she sometimes did when he said something that landed differently than he'd intended. He'd gotten better at noticing that look, which meant he was paying more attention to her face than was strictly professional, which was a thing he was aware of and was choosing, for the moment, not to examine too closely. "Do you apply that to yourself?" she asked. "I try." "Is it working?" He thought about it honestly. Some days better than others. She nodded as if that was the answer she'd expected and found it sufficient. "My father spoke to me," she said, without changing her tone. 2 nights ago, after supper. He sat down across from me and She paused in a way that was different from her usual pauses, heavier. "He apologized." Silas waited. "He said he hadn't understood what I knew, what I'd been doing, that he should have listened when I came to him about the horse." She set her cup on the rail. "He said he hadn't realized he'd been treating me as a piece of furniture," was the phrase in my head, not his. He didn't find that exact language. He said he hadn't been seeing me properly, and he asked what I wanted. "What did you say?" I told him I wanted to be part of the breeding program, that I had ideas about it, that I'd been thinking about bloodlines and temperament selection for years, and that I thought there was a way to build something here that was worth building. She picked up her cup again. "He listened to the whole thing for 20 minutes. He didn't interrupt me once, which—" She stopped. The word that didn't follow wasn't hard to infer. He said yes. "Good," Silas said. "It's not—" She seemed to choose her words with some care. "It's not simple. One conversation doesn't undo years. He knows that, and I know that, and we're both pretending it does a little. Because that's the only way to start over. You have to pretend at first that the thing is already what you want it to become." She looked at the horse. "Which is maybe not so different from what you're doing with him." Silas had never thought of it in exactly those terms, but she wasn't wrong. The letter from the Army came on a Thursday, forwarded through 3 different postmasters from a Colonel Whitmore at Fort Seligman, addressed to Silas in care of Blackridge Ranch, because Colonel Whitmore had made inquiries, and that was the most recent address anyone had for him. Silas read it once in the bunkhouse, alone, before supper. Then he folded it and put it in his breast pocket and went to eat with the hands and listened to them argue about the best way to patch frozen ground, and didn't say anything about the letter. The offer was this. The Army was establishing a program for training cavalry horses at scale, using what they called progressive methods in language that was careful enough that Silas understood it was written by someone who'd had to fight for the language. They needed someone to lead it. The pay was more than Silas had made in any 2-year stretch of his working life. The position would be based in Kansas. It would be permanent as anything involving the government ever was, which both was and wasn't a meaningful guarantee. The letter said his name had come to them from 3 different sources, which meant his reputation had traveled farther than he usually let himself think about. He sat with it during supper and through the evening and lay on his bunk after lights out, and looked at the ceiling and did the kind of thinking that doesn't produce conclusions so much as it maps the territory of the thing you're deciding. He'd been 41 years old when he arrived at Blackridge Ranch. He would be 42 in February. He had a bad knee and a gray mare and a bedroll and a set of skills that had taken him 20 years of failure to develop into something reliable. He had never owned anything that had an address. He had never been anywhere long enough to accumulate the particular kind of weight that places put on people who stay in them. That had been, at various points in his life, a source of pride and a source of grief, and currently it was both, which was one of the signs that something was changing. He thought about the stallion. 2 weeks, he'd told Gideon. Maybe less now. The horse was moving faster than the timeline because horses that are genuinely healing tend to, once the conditions are right. They make up for lost time with an urgency that is both efficient and a little heartbreaking if you let yourself think about it. He thought about a letter to the army that he had not yet written. He thought about a woman at a fence in the early morning with her coffee held in both hands, saying things that landed in him with the precision of someone who understood the exact weight of words. He didn't think about staying, or told himself he wasn't. He told her about the letter on Saturday. He hadn't planned to tell her, hadn't planned not to, just hadn't arrived at a decision about it. And then they were at the fence in the cold morning air, and she said something about a horse she'd been reading about in one of the books from her father's library. A thoroughbred breeding operation in Virginia that had been doing what she wanted to do at Blackridge but 20 years earlier. And in the middle of her describing it, he took the letter out of his pocket and held it out to her. She looked at it, then at him. "Read it," he said. She read it. He watched her face move through the content, which took about a minute, and her expression did several things in that minute that he cataloged without fully understanding. She folded it and handed it back. "Kansas," she said. "Kansas. That's a long way from here." "Most places are." She was quiet, looking at the horse. The stallion was moving freely around the pen now, not contained to his corner, exploring the space with a new quality of purposefulness, as if he was beginning to understand that the space was his as much as it was anyone else's. "Are you going to take it?" she asked. "I haven't decided." "What are the factors?" He turned this over. "It's more money than I've made in 2 years combined. It's permanent. It's a chance to change how a significant number of horses are trained, which matters to me more than the money." He paused. "Those are the arguments for it." "And the arguments against?" He looked at the horse instead of her. "I'd have to leave before the job here is finished." "I could finish it," she said immediately. "I know what to do. You've shown me, and I already understood most of it. It would take longer, and I'd want your notes on the specific things he still hasn't settled with. The approach from the left side, the bit, eventually. But I could do it." "I know you could," he said. The silence that followed was specific. It was the silence of two people who are both waiting to see whether the other person is going to say the real thing. Lydia said, "That's not what you meant." "No," he said. "It's not." She turned and looked at him with the direct look, the practiced into habit look, and this time it had something else in it too. Something that was not practiced, that was the opposite of practiced. "Then say what you meant." He was quiet for a moment. He had spent 41 years being honest with animals, and considerably less honest with people, which was a pattern he'd identified long ago and done very little about. "I meant that I'm not sure I want to go to Kansas." "Because of the work?" "Partly." "And the other part?" He looked at her. "The other part is you." She held very still. Not frozen. She was too composed for frozen, but held still in the way of someone taking something in carefully. He was aware of the absurdity of it, of the impropriety of it by the standards of everything around them, the ranch, the county, the year, all of it. She was her father's daughter, and he was a man who slept in bunkhouses and had no fixed address, and owned one horse called Nothing Special. "I know that's—" he started. "Don't," she said. Not unkindly. "Don't explain it away before I've had a moment with it." He stopped. The moment lasted long enough that the stallion walked to the fence rail and stood there looking at them with his ears forward and his eyes soft, as if he'd recognized something in the quality of the silence. I've been waiting at this fence for months, Lydia said at last. For the horse. And for something else that I didn't have a name for. That I told myself I didn't have a name for because having a name for it made it a thing that could be lost. She looked at the stallion. I know what it is. I've known for a while. Lydia, I'm not asking you to stay, she said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not going to be the thing that someone gave something up for and spent the rest of their time resenting, even quietly, even without meaning to. She finally looked at him. But I'm telling you that if you stay, you're not staying for nothing. He thought about the ceiling of the bunkhouse and the letter in his pocket, and Kansas, and the army, and the particular cold weight of being somewhere versus the particular cold weight of never being anywhere. I have to finish the job first, he said. Yes, you do. And then I have to think. Yes. She picked up her coffee cup. Think carefully. I always do. No, she said, with something that was almost a smile but wasn't quite. I don't think that's true. I think you think fast and move faster, and the thinking you're describing is a thing you haven't had much practice at. She looked at him, thinking about staying. He didn't argue with it. She was right, and they both knew she was right. The saddle went on the stallion for the first time on the following Tuesday, which was a day of cold, clear light and no wind, the kind of November day that felt borrowed from a better season. Silas had spent the previous 3 days simply having the saddle present in the pen, on the ground, on the rail, finally slung across a fence post where the horse could smell it and nuzzle it and make his own conclusions about it. The stallion smelled the saddle for 2 minutes when Silas brought it to his side. He turned his head and looked at it with one eye and then the other, the way horses look at things they're not sure about, thoroughly, from multiple angles, with an attention that deserved more credit than it usually got. Then he turned back to face forward and stood still. Silas put the saddle on him. No bucking, no shying. A single full-body shudder that ran from his withers to his tail, the physical equivalent of a held breath, and then he was still again. Silas left it on for 10 minutes and took it off. He put it on again and left it for 15. Then he walked to the fence where Lydia was standing with both hands on the top rail and her expression doing the thing it did when she was containing something she didn't want to spill. That's the breakthrough, she said. Her voice was under control, but only just. Part of it, he said. There's still the rider. When? End of the week. Maybe sooner. Who's going to ride him? Silas had been thinking about this since the day he'd arrived. The rider mattered as much as everything that came before it. Maybe more, because the first rider was the proof, the moment where everything abstract about trust became concrete and either held or didn't. The wrong rider would undo it. The wrong energy, the wrong hands, the wrong response to the first uncertainty. I was going to ask you, he said. She stared at him. You're the right person, he said. You're not a heavy rider, which matters for a horse this sensitive. You don't have any of the habits he's afraid of. You don't reach, you don't grip before he gives you a reason. You read him faster than anyone I've worked with. He looked at the horse. And he trusts you more than he trusts me, honestly. I've been useful to him. You've been safe to him. Those are different things. I haven't ridden seriously in years, she said. My father didn't... She stopped. Started over. I rode as a girl. Then I stopped. You didn't forget. You don't know that. No, he agreed. But I've watched you move around that horse for 6 weeks and I know how you use your body. You haven't forgotten. She looked at the stallion. He was standing in the center of the pen, not the southeast corner, not the fence rail, the center. With his weight square and his ears forward, and his whole bearing carrying the particular dignity of an animal that has slowly and at great cost arrived at the decision that the world might not require constant bracing. What if I make a mistake, she said. Then you make a mistake, he said, and we correct it and continue. That's all mistakes are. She looked at him for a moment, then she looked back at the horse. Thursday, she said. Give me until Thursday. Thursday, he agreed. What happened between Tuesday and Thursday was not about the horse. It happened on Wednesday evening, after supper, in the main house parlor where Gideon had asked Silas to come in for a conversation, which was unusual enough that Silas arrived with the alert attention of someone who suspects the terrain has shifted. Gideon was sitting in the chair near the window, the one that caught the last of the evening light, which had taken on the specific amber quality of late autumn afternoons, rich and brief. He had a glass of whiskey on the table beside him that he hadn't touched, which meant he'd poured it for company rather than drinking. He poured one for Silas, who took it and sat in the other chair and waited. "I received a letter from Caleb," Gideon said. He said it carefully, like a man testing whether the ground will hold. He wrote to say that he'd thought carefully about the situation, his word, situation, and that he believed the arrangement between our families was not well suited to proceed. Silas said nothing. He was gracious about it. He said Lydia deserved someone whose vision for the future matched hers, that he'd come to understand they had different ideas about how things should be run. Gideon picked up his glass and looked at it without drinking. He wasn't wrong. He was being honest, which cost him something, I think. He set the glass down. "The water rights arrangement is dissolved. We'll manage. We always have." Silas waited again. "I'm not telling you this because I expect anything from you," Gideon said. He said it directly, the way he said most things when he was being honest. "I'm telling you because you've been on this ranch for 6 weeks, and you know my daughter better than most people who've known her for years, and you deserve to have the information." He looked at Silas. "What you do with it is your business." "I appreciate you telling me," Silas said. "She's not easy," Gideon said. It came out with something that was affection and exasperation in equal measure. "She has opinions about everything, and she's right about most of them, and she'll tell you so. She reads too much and sleeps too little, and she has her mother's stubbornness, and—" He stopped. "She's the best thing this ranch has ever had in it, including the horses, including me." He looked at his glass again. "I've been slow to understand that. I'm understanding it now." Silas looked at the amber light on the wall and thought about Kansas and the army letter in his pocket and a woman at a fence saying, "I'm not asking you to stay." "The horse is almost ready," he said. "I know." "End of the week." "Yes." Gideon finally took a sip from his glass. "Then you'll have a decision to make." "I'm aware." "So will I," Gideon said. He seemed to be referring to something Silas wasn't entirely privy to, and he didn't explain further, and Silas didn't ask. Tatim. Thursday came with a sky that couldn't decide between clouds and clearing, the light shifting every 20 minutes from flat gray to sharp and brilliant and back again. The kind of day where you couldn't trust what you were seeing because the light kept changing the truth of it. Lydia was at the pen at the usual time. She was wearing her working clothes and her practical boots and her too large coat, and she had her hair pulled back in the way she did when she meant to be useful rather than anything else. She looked at Silas when he arrived and didn't say good morning. "Ready?" he said. "No," she said. "Let's do it anyway." He went into the pen first, ran through the routine that was now deeply established. The approach, the blanket, the saddle, the stallion standing through all of it with an attention that was engaged rather than endured. When the horse was tacked and settled, Silas walked to the gate. Lydia came through it without pausing. She'd told him she hadn't ridden seriously in years, but the way she moved to the horse's left side, the automatic correctness of it, the angle of approach, the way she put her hand on his neck before anything else, told him what he'd suspected. You don't forget. The body keeps things the mind loses track of. The stallion turned his head and looked at her. His ears were forward. She took a breath, let it out, looked at Silas. "Just mount," he said quietly. "Nothing fancy, just get on and sit and don't ask him for anything." She put her foot in the stirrup. The stallion's ears swiveled back and then forward again. His body gathered slightly, the way a horse's body gathers when it is making a decision. She came up into the saddle with a smoothness that cost her effort. Silas could see it in her jaw, and settled. The horse shifted his weight once, twice, finding the new equation of balance. Then he stood still. The silence in the pen was the silence of something that has been worked toward for weeks finally arriving, which is always different from the silence of nothing happening. It had weight to it, texture, the particular quality of a held breath releasing. Silas let it last for 30 seconds. "Walk him," he said. "Just the rail. Slow." She put the softest possible suggestion through her legs, barely a shift of weight, and the stallion walked. One step, two, finding his own rhythm under this new situation, his ears moving front and sideways and front again as he processed the experience of having a rider and discovering that it didn't hurt. That it was simply weight, movement, a new conversation rather than an old threat. They made one circuit of the pen. When they came back around to where Silas stood, Lydia's face was doing something she wasn't controlling, which was unusual for her. Her eyes were bright with something she was not going to call by its name in front of anyone. "He's good," she said. Her voice was steady. The rest of her less so. "He's so good." "He is," Silas said. 3 months ago they were calling him ruined. 3 months ago nobody was listening to you, he said, which is different. She looked down at him from the saddle with that direct look that had somewhere along the way stopped being practiced and become simply who she was, and there was something in it that he had no language for and didn't need any. She walked the horse around the pen twice more. On the third circuit, she stopped him at the center, the place he had once refused to stand, the place that had been the most exposed and therefore the most threatening, and he stood there quietly with his rider on his back and his ears forward and his weight even on all 4 feet. Silas saw Gideon at the fence rail. He didn't know when the man had arrived. He was standing with his arms folded and his hat pushed back, and he was watching his daughter on that horse with an expression that had no performance in it whatsoever. The expression of a man seeing something clearly, finally, without anything in the way. He caught Silas's eye. He nodded once, slowly. Silas nodded back. When Lydia finally dismounted, she took a moment with her forehead against the stallion's neck. Just a moment. Her eyes closed and her hand flat on his shoulder. The horse stood for it. He didn't pull away. He did the thing that horses sometimes do when they've decided something. He exhaled one long, slow breath, and his whole body settled by a degree, and he was still. She stepped back and looked at the horse and then at Silas, and she said the only thing there was to say. Now what? Silas looked at the pen and the horse and the woman who had come to a fence every morning for 3 months because something in her had known what no one else was willing to see. He looked at the letter in his breast pocket, which he could feel the weight of even through his jacket. He looked at the ranch around them with its frozen ground and its pending winter and all its ordinary, complicated life. Now, he said, I write a letter to Kansas. She looked at him. Something moved across her face. Not surprise, but something that had been waiting to be confirmed. And what does that letter say? She asked. He held her gaze. That I found something worth staying for. She didn't smile. She did something more honest than a smile. She looked at him with the full weight of everything she was, all the years of waiting and watching and knowing things in silence, and she let him see it. All of it. Without arrangement. The stallion shifted behind her, nuzzling at the fence rail with casual curiosity, already beginning to understand that the world was larger than the corner he'd been living in. The letter to Colonel Whitmore took Silas 3 attempts to write. The first attempt was too long. He explained himself in ways that didn't need explaining, justified the decision with reasoning that the colonel hadn't asked for and wouldn't find useful. He read it over, recognized it for what it was, a man arguing with himself on paper, and threw it in the stove. The second attempt was too short. 4 lines that said nothing except the bare fact of declining, which was accurate but had the quality of a door slammed rather than closed. He held it for a moment. Then that one went in the stove too. The third one took him 20 minutes and said what needed saying, that he was grateful for the consideration, that the work the colonel was trying to do was important and deserved someone who could give it their full commitment, and that he had found himself unexpectedly in a situation that required him to be somewhere specific. He did not explain what the situation was. Men like Colonel Whitmore understood that some decisions lived outside the territory of explanation. He sealed it and gave it to Ellis to take to the post, and Ellis took it without asking questions, which Silas appreciated. He didn't feel what he'd expected to feel when it left his hands. He'd expected some version of grief, the specific grief of closing a door on something large, something that could have defined the next decade of his life. What he felt instead was something quieter and less dramatic, something that was closer to relief than loss, which surprised him enough that he sat with it for a while before he trusted it. The barn had that particular smell of deep winter settling in, hay and horses and cold air coming through the gaps in the siding. Nothing special was in the third stall, comfortable and indifferent to the significance of the morning, pulling at her hay with the serene focus of an animal that has never spent a single moment wondering what her life was supposed to be. Silas had always envied horses that. He leaned on the stall door and looked at her and thought about 41 years of moving and the particular kind of person that moving made you. Good at arrivals, terrible at middles, skilled at the management of endings before they became necessary. He had been all of those things. He was not entirely sure he knew how to be anything else. That was the honest part of it, the part he hadn't said to Lydia and hadn't said to Gideon and had barely said to himself, that staying was not just a choice but a skill, and skills you'd never practiced had a learning curve that could make you look like a fool before they made you look like anything else. He was thinking about this when Gideon appeared at the barn entrance. Gideon came down the aisle the way he moved through his own property, with the ease of a man who had walked the same ground for long enough that his feet knew it better than his eyes. He stopped at Nothing Special's stall and looked at the mare with a rancher's automatic assessment, condition, coat, hoof quality, and apparently found what he saw acceptable, because he moved on to looking at Silas. "Letter's gone," Silas said. "Ellis told me." Gideon nodded once. "Kansas." "Kansas." "Well." Gideon looked at the mare again. Something was working in him that he hadn't decided yet how to say. "I want to offer you something, before you make any plans." "All right." "I have a good piece of land on the eastern pasture. About 40 acres, good water access, solid ground. I've been meaning to do something with it for 4 years and haven't had the vision for it, or the right person to work it." He paused. "I'm thinking a training facility. Small. The right size to do the work properly instead of fast." He looked at Silas. "I'd want it built and run by someone who understands what that means." Silas was quiet. "I'm not offering charity," Gideon said, and there was a slight edge on it. The edge of a proud man who needed that understood clearly. "It would be a business arrangement. The ranch benefits, you have a stake in what you build, and—" He stopped. "And my daughter has someone worth talking to in the mornings?" He said the last part with the particular quality of a man who has decided that his daughter's life matters more than his pride, which was not a decision Gideon Mercer arrived at easily, and they both knew it. Silas looked at the barn ceiling. The light coming through the gaps in the boards made long, bright lines in the air. "You're offering me a future," he said, not with irony, just because that was the accurate description. "I'm offering you a piece of ground and a job," Gideon said. "What you make of it is your business." "Does Lydia know you were going to say this?" "No." "Then she doesn't know." "Correct?" "She'd have opinions about it." "She has opinions about everything," Gideon said, and the edge was gone now, replaced by something that was almost warmth. "I've recently started listening to them." He extended his hand. "Think about it." Silas shook his hand. "I don't need to think about it." Something shifted in Gideon's face. "No?" "I'll need to see the land," Silas said, "and I'll want a say in how the facility is built. I have specific ideas about the pen design, the shelter placement, the spacing of the paddocks." He looked at Gideon. "And I'll need to be clear that the methods are mine. What happens with the horses on that 40 acres follows my approach, not whoever comes through with a different opinion about efficiency." Gideon nodded slowly. "Those are fair terms. Then we have an arrangement." They shook hands again, the second time meaning something different than the first. Lydia found out that evening, at supper, not from Silas and not from her father, from Ellis, who was 17 and had no natural understanding of discretion, and who mentioned it at the table with the casual certainty of someone sharing information they assumed everyone already had. "So Mr. Rowan's building on the east pasture, then," he said, reaching past the younger hand for the bread. The table went briefly quiet. Lydia set her fork down. She looked at her father. Gideon had the expression of a man who had planned a conversation and was now conducting it under different conditions than anticipated. "I was going to tell you after supper," he said. "Tell me now?" she said. Her voice was even. Her hands were in her lap. He told her. Concisely, because the table was listening and because Gideon, whatever his shortcomings, did not elaborate unnecessarily. The land, the facility, the arrangement. She was quiet when he finished. The quiet lasted long enough that Ellis appeared to realize he'd said something significant and focused intently on his bread. "You made that decision," she said. "I made the offer," Gideon said. "He accepted. Without speaking to me." "I spoke to him," Gideon said. "The land is mine to offer. The decision to accept was his. You're not a variable in a business arrangement, Lydia. You're—" He stopped, tried again. "You're the reason I thought of it. That's different from it being about you." She sat with this for a moment. Silas, across the table, said nothing. He was aware that the smarter choice here was to say nothing and let the conversation find its own footing. "I would have appreciated being consulted," she said. "Yes," Gideon said. "You would have. I'm sorry for that." Another silence, this one shorter. "Is the land good?" she asked. "Excellent drainage, spring-fed on the north edge." She picked her fork up. "Then it's a reasonable arrangement," she said, and went back to her supper, and the table gradually resumed its normal noise, and Ellis ate 3 more pieces of bread because stress made him hungry. Later, in the cold outside the kitchen door, where both of them had gone after supper in the way they'd developed of finding space when the indoor air was too full of other people's attention, Lydia stood with her arms crossed against the cold and looked at the eastern pasture, which was invisible in the dark but present in the imagination. "You should have told me first," she said. "Your father asked me not to. He wanted to offer it himself." "That was still a choice you made." "It was," he said, "and it wasn't the right one. I'm aware." She looked at him. The outdoor light from the kitchen window was enough to see by and not much more than that. "Are you actually going to stay?" "I sent the letter." "Letters can be unsent. Arrangements can be undone." She looked at him directly. "I need you to be certain, not because I require certainty as a condition, but because I'm not 20 years old and I've had enough things that almost were and then weren't, and She paused. "I'm tired of that particular experience." He turned and looked at her in the way he'd learned to look at things that mattered, fully, without the part of him that usually kept an eye on the exit. "I'm certain," he said. "I'm not certain about everything. I'm not certain I know how to be someone who stays or that I won't make mistakes because of that. I'm certain I don't want to leave. That's what I've got." She looked at him for a long time. "That's enough," she said. "For now." The cold was serious, and neither of them was dressed for a long conversation outside, and they went back in without resolving everything because not everything requires resolving in the same conversation. Some things need to be decided by doing them rather than by talking about them, and they both understood that, which was one of the things they had in common that neither of them had said explicitly. The first week of December brought weather that made November look like an apology. The wind came from the northwest with a weight behind it, the kind of cold that wasn't interested in being experienced from the outside and made everything beyond necessity feel beside the point. The stallion stayed in the barn during the worst of it. Silas and Lydia worked with him there. Smaller space, which he'd have had trouble with 2 months ago, and now simply accepted as the weather's condition rather than a trap. He was becoming, day by day, the horse he had always had the potential to be. Attentive, responsive, enormous in his intelligence, carrying himself with a quality that the ranch hands who'd called him ruined would not have recognized. Pruitt, the ranch foreman, stopped at the barn door one afternoon and watched Lydia put the horse through his paces in the cleared center aisle. When she brought him to a halt and the horse stood square and still, Pruitt said without turning his head, "That's something." He didn't specify what that something was. He didn't need to. He'd been on this ranch 11 years, and he'd seen the previous several months, and that economy of language was its own form of acknowledgement. "He's good," Lydia said. "The horse is good," Pruitt said. "You're better." He walked on. Lydia stood very still for a moment after he'd gone. Not performing the moment for anyone, Silas was at the far end of the aisle, and she didn't know he'd heard, or maybe didn't care. Just standing there holding that small, honest compliment from a man who'd never given her one, letting it be what it was without minimizing it. He thought about what she'd said at the fence months ago, about waiting, about knowing things in silence. He thought about all the years between the girl who'd first picked up a book about horses in her father's library and the woman who had walked into a pen with a panicked animal and held it together through pure competence and calm. You couldn't see those years on her face, but you could see what they'd built if you looked at the right things. Silas started work on the eastern pasture in the second week of December, with the ground frozen enough to make the preliminary planning easier, and the actual construction something that would have to wait for spring. He walked it with Gideon and with Pruitt and with a local man named Harker who built things and understood how structures needed to sit on land through seasons. He walked it with Lydia, who had more specific opinions about sight lines and shelter positioning than Harker, and who was right about most of them, which Harker discovered through the specific experience of arguing one point and later standing at the place where the alternate position would have been and acknowledging without much enthusiasm that she'd been right. She's right about things, Harker told Silas, with the tone of a man conveying information rather than registering a complaint. I've noticed that, Silas said. It's unusual, Harker said. I think she'd argue it's not, Silas said. I think she'd say it's just unusual for it to be acknowledged. Harker thought about this. I can see that, he said, and went back to his measurements. The afternoons were short, and the evenings came in fast and dark. The ranch settled into winter rhythms that were different from fall rhythms, slower in some ways, more urgent in others. The urgency not of growth, but of maintenance, of keeping everything alive and functioning through the season until the turning came. In those evenings, Silas and Lydia had taken to sitting at the kitchen table after the hands had eaten, and the kitchen woman had gone home, with the stove still warm and the coffee still reasonably drinkable, going over the breeding records that Lydia had been compiling for months in a notebook she'd been keeping privately. There were years of observation in that notebook, bloodline notes and temperament assessments and performance observations that were more detailed and more useful than anything the ranch had ever officially documented. You've been doing this for years, Silas said the first night she brought it out. Since I was 23, she said. Your father doesn't know this exists? He didn't know a lot of things existed, she said. Not bitter, just accurate. She laid it out across the table, and they went through it together, and Silas began to understand the full shape of what she'd built in private, which was an education as complete as anything you could have gotten in a formal setting, assembled entirely through attention and reading and the refusal to stop thinking about things just because no one had given her permission to. He also began to understand, more fully than he had before, what it cost a person to know things that had no outlet. The specific weight of that. The years of carrying it. He said so, one evening, plainly. She looked up from the notebook. It kept me going, she said. The knowing, even without the outlet. Because I figured eventually... She paused. I figured eventually the outlet would come. That I just had to hold on to the knowing until it did. What made you think that? When nothing suggested it was true. She considered this. The horses, she said at last. I watched enough frightened animals come through this ranch. Most of them eventually found their footing when they got the right conditions. It made me think... She was quiet for a moment. It made me think that the capacity doesn't disappear just because the conditions are wrong. You just have to wait for the conditions to change. He looked at her across the table in the warm light of the kitchen stove and thought about a woman at a fence in the early dark, holding her coffee with both hands, who had been right about everything and had found a way to keep being right all by herself for long enough that it mattered when someone finally showed up to confirm it. I'm sorry it took so long, he said. He meant it in more ways than one, and she understood that and didn't simplify it. You got here, she said. That's the part that counts. They married in January before the worst of winter had passed. Not a large ceremony, Sarah. Neither of them wanted large, and Gideon, who had learned over the previous months that what Lydia wanted carried more weight than what the county expected, didn't argue for it. There were a handful of witnesses. Pruitt, who stood with the particular dignity of a man attending something he considers important. Ellis, who cried briefly and then denied it. Harker, who came because he'd been building their house on the eastern pasture and seemed to feel a craftsman's investment in the occupants. And a few of the longer-serving ranch hands who'd been at Blackridge long enough that the occasion felt like a family event even to them. The house wasn't finished yet. The exterior was framed and the roof was on and the windows were in, but the interior was still boards and plans and the smell of new wood. Lydia had walked through it the week before, touching the framing where the walls would be, standing in the open space that would eventually be the kitchen, looking at the eastern view from the window opening that had not yet been framed. "It's going to be good," she said. Not with performance, with the assessment of someone who had spent years looking at things honestly and knew the difference between good and the appearance of it. "It's going to be cold until spring," Silas said. "Yes," she agreed. "That too." So each surprise. They stayed in the main house until it was ready, which was a particular kind of patience that required navigation between Lydia's wish for her own space and Gideon's genuine wish for company, and the navigation was not always smooth and occasionally involved raised voices, and at least one night when Silas slept in the bunkhouse because the alternative was saying something he'd regret. But they navigated it, imperfectly and without any of it being resolved by the kind of grand gestures that stories tend to lean on. Just the small daily work of people learning to coexist in close quarters while wanting different things from the same space. That was the part that no one talked about when they talked about new beginnings. The part where new beginnings were built out of the same ordinary mornings as everything else, with the same friction and the same stupid misunderstandings and the same requirement of waking up the next day and trying again. The stallion's first foal came in late March. The mare had been selected carefully, over months of conversation between Silas and Lydia that drew on her notebook and his experience and a good deal of honest disagreement that eventually produced consensus. She was a gray mare from a rancher 3 counties over, not showy, but with a quality of steadiness that both of them had identified, independently, as the thing most worth passing on. When Lydia first said steadiness, Silas had looked at her and said yes, and they'd agreed on the mare in under 5 minutes, which was faster than they agreed on most things. The foal was born at 3 in the morning on a night when the temperature had climbed back above freezing for the first time in weeks, and the stars were hard and clear, and the ranch was quiet with the quality of a place that had made it through something and was taking a breath on the other side. Silas was there. Lydia was there. Gideon, who had claimed he wasn't going to stay up, appeared in the barn door at 2:45 in his coat over his nightclothes, and didn't say anything about that. The foal was a bay, darker than his father. He hit the straw with the usual ungainly urgency of new horses, all legs and determination and no particular grace, and was on his feet inside 20 minutes and nursing inside 30, and the stallion in the adjacent stall was pacing the fence line with the agitated curiosity of an animal who understood something significant was happening on the other side of the wall. Lydia sat in the straw next to the foal, which was not a clean place to sit, and she ran her hand down his neck with the same flat-palm steadiness she'd learned at the fence and refined in the pen and had been practicing without knowing she was practicing for years before that. The foal looked at her with the enormous, unfocused eyes of something that has just arrived and is still assembling the concept of the world. "He's not afraid," she said. "He hasn't learned to be yet," Silas said from the rail. "Maybe he won't need to." She kept her hand on the foal. "If we do this right." That was the whole project, distilled. Not the horses specifically, not the breeding program, not the facility going up on the eastern pasture piece by piece through the spring. All of that was real and mattered and had its own value. But underneath it was this, the idea that fear was not inevitable, that the conditions you built around something determined more about what it became than anything essential to its nature. That a frightened thing, given the right time and the right space, and someone willing to be patient, could become entirely different from the frightened thing it had been. Not by erasing what it had been through, but by building enough safety around it that the fear stopped taking up all the available room. Gideon stood at the stall door and looked at his daughter in the straw and the foal with its enormous eyes and his son-in-law at the rail, and the stallion pacing next door with all his recovered dignity, and he had the particular expression of a man who has arrived at understanding too late and is choosing to make something of that rather than collapse under it. He was 61 years old. He had run this ranch for 30 years. He had made 1,000 decisions and gotten a fair proportion of them right, and a proportion he didn't calculate out loud wrong. And the ones he was beginning to understand most clearly were the quiet ones, the ones made by omission, by inattention, by deciding that certain people in his life fit certain slots and not looking past the slot to see what was actually there. He'd been doing that work for months. It was slow, and it wasn't finished, and it would probably never be finished in the way that things on checklists get finished, because this was the other kind of work. The kind that was just the practice of paying attention differently, which you could get better at but never complete. She's going to build something here, he said. Not to anyone specifically, to the barn, maybe, to himself. She already has, Silas said. Gideon nodded. He stood there a while longer, and then he went back to the house to sleep, because he was 61 and the barn was cold and there was nothing else he needed to do here tonight. The hard part of his job was done, and the nature of that job had changed, and he was old enough to know that changing was harder than most people admitted and worth more than most people acknowledged. Spring came the way springs do in that country, not announced, just gradually present. The ground softened. The light stayed later. The new grass came up in the pastures with the particular green that only existed for about 2 weeks before it settled into the normal green of the season. And the horses in the paddock seemed to understand it was coming before the people did, moving with a looseness in their joints that the cold had been suppressing. The facility on the eastern pasture was finished in April. Not elaborate, Silas had been specific about that, had turned down every suggestion toward impressiveness in favor of function, which sometimes required more thought and cost more argument than simply building the thing that looked right. The paddocks were sized for horses that needed room to feel they had options. The shelter placement was exactly where Lydia had said it should be, catching morning light and blocking the northwest wind. The training pen was round and larger than standard because Silas had spent 20 years concluding that horses thought better when they had more space to do it in. The morning they opened it, Lydia stood in the center of the pen and looked at the line of the fence and the way the early light moved across the ground and said, "This is what I thought it could be." "It's not finished," Silas said. He meant functionally. There was still equipment to source, another paddock fence to complete. "Nothing is ever finished," she said. "I meant the idea of it." He came and stood next to her in the center of the pen, the same position they'd stood in with the stallion during those first uncertain weeks. And they looked at what they'd built together, which was not a perfect thing, and had not been built without friction, and would require maintenance and adjustment and the willingness to be wrong about specific details on a regular basis. It was in that way exactly like everything worth keeping. The stallion was in the first paddock, grazing with the unhurried attention of an animal that has enough to eat and nowhere urgent to be. He looked up once when they walked by, identified them, and went back to his grass. He did not watch the gate. He did not track for exits. He stood in the open center of his paddock with his weight easy and his head down and his whole bearing carrying the specific quality of an animal at rest. Not braced, not waiting for something bad, just present in the place where he was. Silas stood at the paddock rail and watched him for a long time. He thought about the horse that had arrived at Blackridge the autumn before, the animal with the white-edged eyes and the wall-crashing panic, and the years of mishandling compressed into a terror so total it had looked like aggression to everyone who hadn't bothered to look closely enough. You couldn't see those months in him now, but you could see what they'd built on the other side of them if you knew what to look for. A horse that had learned, slowly and at great cost and with more patience than most people in his life had ever offered, that the world could be navigated rather than endured, that other creatures could be trusted, at least provisionally, at least enough to stand near them without bracing. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the only thing that mattered. Lydia came and stood beside him. She didn't say anything for a while. She just stood and watched the horse graze in the morning light, the same way she'd stood at a fence all those months ago watching him from a distance, except that now the distance was different, was chosen rather than imposed, was the natural space between a person and an animal that has been given enough freedom that closeness is a preference rather than a demand. "Do you ever think about the version of this that didn't happen?" she said. "What version?" "The one where you took the army offer, or where my father didn't listen, or where Caleb went into that pen a day earlier and it broke the whole thing." She paused. "All the ways it could have gone wrong." "Sometimes," he said honestly, "less than I used to." "Me too." She was quiet for a moment. "I used to think mostly about the things that almost weren't, all the near misses in the other direction." She watched the horse. "Now I mostly think about what is." He looked at her. "Is that better?" She considered it seriously the way she considered most things. Yes, she said, it's harder sometimes. Paying attention to what's actually here instead of what could go away. But it's better. The morning was fully arrived by then, the light no longer amber but clear and direct. The kind of spring morning that didn't apologize for being good. The stallion lifted his head once, looked out toward the eastern horizon with his ears forward, and then went back to his grass with the tranquil certainty of an animal that has finally learned to believe in the ground beneath its feet. Silas put his arm around Lydia's shoulders, and she leaned against him slightly, not dramatically, just the small, natural shift of two people who have gotten used to the weight of each other. They stood that way in the clear morning at the rail of a paddock on 40 acres of eastern pasture that had been nothing a year ago and was now the beginning of something neither of them had known to plan for. That was the thing about trust, Silas had decided, not the grand version that people wrote about, the kind that was declared and celebrated and made into something ceremonial, the ordinary version, the kind that was built one small choice at a time, in cold mornings at fence rails and difficult conversations, and the willingness to stand still when everything in you wanted to move, the kind that didn't announce itself, that just showed up, eventually, in what you found yourself willing to risk and what you found yourself unwilling to walk away from. He had spent 41 years learning that the hardest thing wasn't breaking something wild. The hardest thing was staying still long enough for the wild thing to decide you weren't a threat. And then staying after that, through all the ordinary mornings, all the weather, all the slow, patient work of two lives becoming one thing. He was still learning it. He expected he would be for a long time. That seemed about right.